united. Notice he says it this way, the paradox at the top of 503. A book at once quenches the thirst for knowledge and ignites new fires. And as sophomores, we have a tendency sometimes to start to settle into the high school grind. This place, so boring. You can read a line like this and say, wait a minute. If there's a book available to me, there are ideas. New ideas. And if there are new ideas available to me, that's something that can light me up. That's something that can excite me in some way. By the way, he talks about this small little library that Miss Pansy, his librarian, we think of our own librarian here, don't we, right, in Miss Overcast, who has for so many years tried to share her love of learning and ideas with the students of Worland High School. And Miss Pansy here, our librarian, he says, notice he says, I consumed the books. Write this down at 3A. When you're a senior, we're going to study a famous essay by the inventor, in many ways, of the essay, Francis Bacon. And the essay is called Of Studies. And in that amazing essay, by the way, it's available online at learnstrong.net in the Senior A folder. You can go and find it if you wish. And you can study it before you become a senior. But he makes this argument. Reading a book and eating, very similar. Some books are to just be kind of sniffed at or barely tasted. Some books are to be chewed, and he says some few books are to be chewed up and digested. Now, obviously, he's not talking about going to the library or picking up your anthology and starting chewing on the book. No, that's not it. So what's he saying? Borrowing from this idea. When you read well, you consume the information. It somehow affects you. It makes you think differently. And that, he says, notice, that is what leads to feeding the imagination. If you are bored, it's simply because you do not yet allow your imagination to really ignite, to burn, right? And that's the challenge for us. All right, let's continue. Late in the afternoon, notice bottom of page 503, top of page 504. Let's enjoy the end of this essay.
Late in the afternoon, when I was satiated with reading, when I could no longer hold in my soul the characters that crowded there,
504.
I heard the call of the llano, the real world of my father's ranchito, the solid, warm world of my mother's kitchen. Then, to the surprise and bewilderment of Miss Pansy, I would rush out and race down the streets of our town, books tucked under my shirt, in my pockets, clutched tightly to my breast. Mad with the insanity of books, I would cross the river to get home, shouting my crazy challenge even at La Llorona, and that poor spirit of so many frightening cuentos would wither and withdraw. She was no match for me. Those of you who have felt the same exhilaration from reading, or from love, will know about what I am speaking. Alas, the people of the town could only shake their heads and pity my mother. At least one of her sons was a bit touched. Perhaps they were right, for few will trade a snug reality to float on words to other worlds. And now, there are 1,000,000 volumes for us to read, here at the University of New Mexico Library. Books on every imaginable subject, in every field. A history of the thought of the world, which we must keep free of censorship, because we treasure our freedoms. It is the word freedom which eventually must reflect what this collection, or the collection of any library, is all about. We know that as we preserve and use the literature of all cultures, we preserve and regenerate our own. The old ones knew and taught me this. They eagerly read the few newspapers that were available. They kept their diaries, they wrote décimas and cuentos, and they survived on their oral stories and traditions.
Okay, let's pause, write it down at level 1. The ideas now that he's presenting for us are, he had to leave the library and get back home running with his books in his hand. It's a wonderful word picture, right? Running with his books in his hands to get back home. In other words, he's not going to stay in the library. He recognizes there's a relationship. Let's put this in our notes at 2A. There's a relationship between learning ideas and then living in the real world. And if those ideas have any relevancy at all, I mean, don't Don't just like text because an instructor tells you to like text with their quote-unquote classic texts. If an idea has any relevancy at all, it's because it somehow affects you in this world you live in. It somehow has an effect. Notice he talks about the preservation, the importance of preservation. Did you notice that he talks about loving books like loving other people? There's a similar kind of affection there. Let's pause for just a moment and talk grammar usage for just a second. There's normally a rule that says you try to never finish a sentence with a preposition. Look on page 504. We've got an interesting dynamic at play here. Do you see the first full paragraph that says, those of you who have felt the same exhilaration from reading or from love will know about what I'm speaking. Now, the normal way to write that sentence would be what? Those of you who have felt the same exhilaration from reading or from love will know what I am speaking about. But there's this rule that says we try to not finish a sentence with a preposition, and so notice the construction. But jump down a few sentences later. He says, we got to worry about censorship, because censorship, we can't stop the free passage of ideas. We need those ideas. We think back to our text, The Censor. We think back to Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. But notice, it is a word, freedom, which eventually must reflect what this collection, or the collection of any library, are you reading it with me? Look how he finishes the sentence, is all about. So notice here, he elects to finish his sentence with a preposition. In other words, let's put it this way. There's no necessity that one not finish a sentence with a preposition. We can recognize a different kind of tone even within this one paragraph. When you don't finish the sentence with a preposition, the word about, you have a certain kind of academic tone. Then a few lines later, a more, we would say, normal tone, right? The old ones knew, and he says, taught me the value of freedom because of ideas. Finally, a 3A observation. Notice we're working as we go through this. The great emancipated slave Frederick Douglass, who we will study, by the way, next year in our junior offering, made the observation that true slavery is not when someone manacles the wrists, not when someone throws you inside of a room with bars. That is not true slavery. True slavery is when you cannot read, when you cannot write, because your mind cannot expand. And Douglass will write in his famous autobiography about that moment when he learns to read. And then he reads the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he looks up and he's crying because he can't believe this is the founding document of America. Why is it so that I have not ever read this before? Because I didn't know how to read. Why? Because it was illegal in the South to teach your slaves to read. Why? Because once they know how to read, they can begin to think. And once they can think, they can begin to dream. The challenge then is to recognize in our sophomore year the degree to which we have been slaves, refusing to learn of our own account. That is the key for us. To open, to unlock the rooms that we've put ourselves in by limiting our knowledge, by limiting our desire for knowledge. All right, let's go back to it. He's going to go to another time, another library. Again, reflective essay writing. It's beautiful because it takes us back to a time for him, but it makes us remember a time for ourselves as well.
Another time, another library. I entered Albuquerque High School library, prepared to study, because that's where we spent our study time. For better or for worse, I received my first contracts as a writer there. It was a place where budding lovers spent most of their time writing notes to each other. And when my friends who didn't have the gift of words found out I could turn a phrase, I quickly had all the business I could do. I wrote poetic love notes for a dime apiece, and thus worked my way through high school.
Page 505.
And there were fringe benefits, because the young women knew very well who was writing the sweet words, and many a heart I was supposed to capture fell in love with me. And so, a library is also a place where love begins.
Beautiful, right?
A library should be the heart of a city. With its storehouse of knowledge, it liberates, informs, teaches, and enthralls. A library indeed should be the cultural center of any city. Amidst the bustle of work and commerce, the great libraries of the world have provided a sanctuary where scholars and common man alike come to enlarge and clarify knowledge, to read and reflect in quiet solitude. I knew a place like this. I spent many hours in the old library on Central Avenue and Edith Street. But my world was growing, and quite by accident, I wandered up the hill to enroll in the University of New Mexico. And what a surprise lay in store for me. The libraries of my childhood paled in comparison to this new wealth of books housed in Zimmerman Library. Here, there were stack after stack of books, and ample space and time to wander aimlessly in this labyrinth of new frontiers. I had known the communal memory of my people through the newspapers and few books my grandfather read to me, and through the rich oral tradition handed down by the old ones. Now, I discovered the collective memory of all mankind at my fingertips. I had only to reach for the books that laid all history bare. Here, I could converse with the writers from every culture on earth, old and new, and at the same time, I began my personal odyssey, which would add a few books to the collection, which in 1981 would come to house 1 million volumes. Those were exciting times. Around me swirled the busy world of the university, in many aspects, an alien world. Like many fellow undergraduates, I sought refuge in the library. My haven during those student university years was the reading room of the west wing of the old library. There, I found peace. The carved vigas decorating the ceiling, the solid wooden tables and chairs, and the warm adobe color of the stucco were things with which I was familiar. There, I felt comfortable. With books scattered around me, I could read and doze and dream. I took my breaks in the warm sun of the portal, where I ate my tortilla sandwiches, which I carried in my brown paper bag. There, with friends, I sipped coffee as we talked of changing the world and exchanged idealistic dreams.
506.
That is a rich and pleasant time in my memory. No matter how far across the world I find myself in the future, how deep in the creation of worlds with words, I shall keep the simple and poignant memories of those days. The sun set golden on the ochre walls, and the green pine trees and the blue spruce, sacred trees to our people, whispered in the breeze. I remembered my grandfather meeting with the old men of the village in the Resolana of one of the men's homes, or against the wall of the church on Sundays, and I remembered the things they said. Later, alone, dreaming against the sun-warmed wall of the library, I continued that discourse in my mind. Yes, the library is a place where people should gather. It is a place for research, reading, and for the quiet fomentation of ideas. But because it houses the collective memory of our race, it should also be a place where present issues are discussed and debated and researched in order for us to gain the knowledge and insight to create a better future. The library should be a warm place that reflects the needs and aspirations of the people.
All right, let's pause now at level 1 just to finish. Notice how he finishes this essay by returning. Notice he kind of goes through his life from the time he was very young to the time he ended up at university as a student. And of course, now he is a professional writer. The time when he was a student at university, he remembers what it was like to go into the library. The library was for him a place of sanctuary, right? Security. Go back to page 505. He starts talking about libraries, the significance of libraries. The library indeed should be the cultural center of any city. Put it in your notes. Although he doesn't mention it, we remember the greatest library, maybe in the history of libraries in the history of the world, the great library in Alexandria, that city in North Africa. And then, of course, today we think about the Library of Congress. It's fascinating to me, the number of my seniors who travel with Mr. Doerr to Washington, D.C., and will return to talk about all the different places they've been to in the city. But the place that often they will say is the one that blew them away the most was the Library of Congress as they walked in there. If you've never been to the nation's capital, maybe this is an aspiration for you. Notice he says that it was here at the Zimmerman Library, I'm on page 505, that you could wander aimlessly in this labyrinth of new frontiers. This wandering takes us to think about the greatest story of all stories, the greatest wanderer, namely Odysseus. And then notice in the next paragraph, it's as if somehow Anna wants you to go there, as he says, it was here I could converse with the writers from every culture on earth, old and new, and at the same time I began my, there it is, do you read it? Personal Odyssey, which would add a few books to the collection. That is to say, he grew up to write some books that ended up in the very library. Think about how cool that is. He wrote books that ended up in the very library where he had spent his university years trying to find himself. Notice he called it a refuge in the next paragraph. Libraries should be a refuge. All right, let's jump now to 2a really quickly. This obviously is a celebration of a number of things. Notice he keeps talking about the old one, talking about his grandfather, talking about, Miss Pansy and the others who were influential in his life, who were adults when he was a child. What is for you the major message of a text like this? Some will argue it has everything to do with celebrating libraries and the importance of these places that collect so much of human wisdom. I've had sophomores that say, it's funny, after this essay, I walk by that library and I look in it even when there's nobody in there, and I see all those books and I think differently. I've never thought about a library from this perspective. Like falling in love, that I do understand and desire. But what about falling in love with ideas, falling in love with books, falling in love with the past? Can I do that? Yeah, it's called a library. Some will see the message that way. Number 2, some will read this essay and they will say the most important element of this essay is about the respect for the past. How in our world we have a tendency to make fun of the old. Right? So I heard a sophomore the other day making fun of his grandpa because his grandpa got the new smartphone and didn't know how to turn it on or use it. Ha ha ha, how funny that is, because he couldn't figure it out. Yeah, that's true. But your grandpa lived in a lifetime, didn't need a smartphone, had to figure out stuff for his or her own. You got me? In other words, there's a respect that this essay is suggesting that we should pay attention to. Finally, number 3, another 2A message. What about this one? We're all connected. We're connected through the spaces that we hold sacred, and communities should hold sacred their libraries. Now again, I asked at the beginning of our discussion, is it still the case today that we hold these spaces as sacred? Because the technologies have allowed for us to be able to have access to so many of these ideas and books through our technologies. You don't actually have to go to the physical space of the library anymore. Many of our major libraries have all of their holdings and volumes now available online. So that, for example, college students don't even have to go to the college library to study anymore. They can get all of that information. What are your thoughts about that one? Let's jump really quickly to 2B. Obviously, this is a reflective essay. What's the most important symbol for you? By the way, did you notice the end of the essay? Trees. Anna likes to reference trees. He sees the tree, as we have often said about Ruthie's tree. He sees the tree as being a powerful symbol. The deeper those roots go, the more healthy that tree is. Which obviously will beg some questions at 3B. How deep are your roots? Your idea roots. This understanding, this self-understanding that we are developing in our sophomore year, how deep does that go for you? And is it possible that maybe those roots need watered a little bit? Maybe that's what ideas are for us, that watering, right? 3A, what's the text for you? I mean, we've obviously mentioned a whole bunch here. What's the text for you that most celebrates new ideas, growth, new understandings? And do you have a text that's one of your favorites about libraries and about reading? Finally, at 3A, we began with these questions, we'll finish. For you, when was the last time you were in a library? When was the first time you were in a library? Can you remember that? The very first time you ever stepped into a room with a whole bunch of books, and maybe it felt foreign, maybe it felt incredibly exhilarating. To what degree do you need to go back to libraries and feed the imagination? Well, there you go, an introduction to the celebration of libraries. I hope that maybe you've been challenged to visit one. Thank you.